Restoration comedy. The Restoration was an era in English history that followed a bout of civil war in the 17th century. The English Civil War was marked by the rule of Oliver Cromwell, a Puritan leader who took control of Britain following the execution of the king and the exile of the king's heir. This period of Puritan rule was notable because it illegalized theater and public performance. But just a few years after Cromwell began his reign, however, Puritanism lost its momentum and the heir to the throne returned to rule Britain. This momentous period is known as the Restoration. Charles II, the King of Britain, ruled the nation and led the Restoration regime. During this period, theater was legalized again and supported by Charles II, who was an avid fan of the performing arts. This era resulted in a bawdy, risque genre of theater known as Restoration comedy. The genre of Restoration comedy is notable for numerous reasons. First, the style of Restoration comedy represented a backlash against the extremely moral, highly conservative views of the Puritans. The resulting plays were sexually provocative and daring for the time. Second, the theater became much more aware of public trends. As a result, costumes were changed almost weekly to keep up with the latest fashion trends, and several jokes about current events were written into plays. The era was also marked with the advent of the first celebrity actors. Audiences began paying attention to particular actors, and performances were advertised based upon the actors in them. The audience that viewed the plays also changed. Prior to the English Civil War, the theater was almost exclusively for members of the aristocracy. The burgeoning middle class in Britain allowed for non-aristocratic members of society to afford tickets. Since the target demographic for the theater shifted, the performances shifted as well. Most of these changes were fueled by the theatrical environment that started just following the arrival of Charles II. Upon his return to power, the king granted royal patents to two organizations. These patents granted exclusive rights to stage performances. However, the relatively small market for theater performances prompted the two houses to fiercely compete. Both organizations constructed large, ornate theaters. Forced to compete for a paying audience, the two groups attempted to keep pace with cultural trends and be extremely responsive to shifts in taste. This created a demand for popular actors and actresses, thus raising the pay for well-known performers. New plays were also in high demand and could give one theatrical organization an edge over the other. With this frantically competitive dash for all things new and popular, the recently legalized theatrical environment had new life breathed into it. However, one organization eventually prevailed and absorbed the second. The lack of competition resulted in decreased pay for performers. Upset at this new pay structure, performers protested and created their own theatrical group to compete. This eventually led to sensationalized performances that included jugglers, rope dancers, and animals, effectively ending the era of Restoration comedy. Most Restoration comedy borrowed heavily from a number of influences. For instance, playwrights drew from the classical Greek and Roman plays, but also looked to the theater of the French and Spanish for inspiration. The Restoration era's aggression towards Puritanism prompted sexualized themes to be incorporated into most plays. These somewhat base plots would later be recycled to make statements about social changes and shifting cultural views. Competing theatrical groups attempted to continue to appeal to the middle classes by keeping the racy, emotional plots that marked the beginning of Restoration comedy, while bringing in social concerns and arguments for the educated aristocracy. With the evolution of the prim and proper Victorian society, though, Restoration comedy lost much of its appeal with the general public, as it was thought to be inappropriate and poor-mannered. Its decline caused most scholars to ignore the comedy of the Restoration era during the 18th and 19th centuries. However, interest has been restored in the contemporary era. Many cultural scholars have used Restoration comedy and its fall from popularity to observe common notions of propriety and how they may change. Restoration comedy remains an interesting example of shifting cultural views.